Awesome. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Great. Let me out of the way. So we do have some chairs up here. If people are looking for a seat, there are chairs up here. I see a chair back there. So we have some space, and thank you to whoever's bringing in some more chairs. I really appreciate your help. And if you haven't noticed, we also have pizza and drinks, so please help yourself food. And I think we'll get started because I think we have a lot to talk about. So if you don't already know me, I'm Debbie Schulkraut. I'm in the Political Science Department, and welcome to our event on What Now, what we might expect the Trump presidency to mean for domestic and international politics. We want to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion, and we also have several panelists. So the way this is going to work is I'll introduce our panelists, and then our panelists will each speak. I've asked them to speak for about 5 minutes about their area of expertise and what's been on their minds since the election. And then we'll hopefully have lots of time to answer questions you guys have and engage in discussion. So first, before that, let me also do a few thank yous for this event. He's not here, but I'd like to thank Abdul Salam, the Political Science Department, who helped make all this possible, and his partner in crime, Jess Burns, who is right there. Thank you, Jess, for all your help. Thank you. And also Nick in the Political Science Department back there has been helping us set up tonight. And the folks at IT who have made sure that Professor Beckley can zoom in and that we have microphones. And our co-sponsors, besides the Political Science Department, are the Tisch College and the IR Department. Also, we are recording this event because we have a department YouTube channel where we like to post events, and I've heard from people who can come tonight who'd like to watch the recording. So just FYI, we are recording this event. And let's see. So without further ado, as I said, I'm Debbie Schulkraut. My area of expertise is public opinion, political behavior, particularly with issues related to race, ethnicity, and immigration. And I also study and teach political psychology. And we have Meredith McClain, whose area of expertise is the presidency, the executive branch, and the bureaucracy. We have Sam Gabru, who will be talking about state-federal relations, and reading the Boston Globe this week, there's already tensions between the state of Massachusetts and the incoming federal administration. And also he is going to speak on U.S.-Africa relations. We have Professor Malik Mufti, who will be talking with us about politics in the Middle East and international relations more generally. We have Mike Beckley, who is joining us on Zoom, who is an expert on U.S.-China relations and Chinese foreign policy. We have Professor Shevil, who is en route from another work engagement. So she will be going last on our program, but she will be arriving to join us in a little bit. Professor Art was on the program. He's not able to join us today, and I believe that is our lineup. So without further ado, I am going to hand the microphone over to Professor McClain. Sit, stand, whatever you prefer. Talk to us about what's on your mind in your area of expertise in light of the election results from last week.
All right, hello. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I guess I'll stand. I'm not very tall, so I can't see all of you when I'm sitting. So I'll stand and kind of lord over everyone at the table. So Professor Schulkraut says, what's on your mind since the election? The thing that's on my mind is the bureaucracy, which maybe is on some of y'all's minds as well. So I'm going to think today about, or kind of talk to you about, how the president, and President Trump specifically coming in, might try to take control of the bureaucracy and might try to bring it closer under to his purview. So there's a few ways we think of presidents taking the bureaucracy and bringing it closer to it. So if you're in one of my classes, this is I'm going to drone on, and you can close your eyes for a second and wait for the foreign policy stuff. But the president has a few ways. So he can centralize. That one's not quite as fun. And the one I'm talking about today is he can politicize. He can appoint people to the federal bureaucracy that are closer in line to him, that are going to hopefully help implement his policy at the federal level. So President Trump, we've seen this. So if you saw in the news today, Matt Gaetz has removed himself from contention for the AG position. If you're in my presidency seminar, I think only once a year. We'll talk about it on Monday. But so he's removed himself from contention. But we've seen a number of other folks who have been brought up. And Professor Schulkraut says to me, what about DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency? She's like, can he do that? So presidents can create departments. And they can also appoint the people with them. So President Trump can create the Department of Government Efficiency. He cannot create it on his own. He is working in a separation of power system. So come January, if Congress wants to decide to allocate funding, we might now have the Department of Government Efficiency that is headed by two individuals, which if you take one of my classes, we can discuss why it's actually inefficient to have two people in charge of a department. But he can create this department with the approval of Congress. So that's one way. He might be creating a department. He also might be politicizing, as I mentioned a minute ago, and be appointing people to these positions. He's appointed a number of people or said who he's going to be appointing. No appointments are official yet because we do not have a Congress, his new Congress in session, nor has he been inaugurated. However, we know that he has this power. And right now he has this power over about 4,000-ish members of the bureaucracy. This is 4,000 out of 2.5 million individuals in the federal bureaucracy who are political appointees. Some of these individuals require Senate confirmation. We see that after Matt Gaetz met with the Senate, he decided he didn't think his chances were so good, so he removed himself. That's a position, the AG, that requires Senate confirmation. Not all of them do. Some of them presidents can appoint without Senate confirmation, Schedule C appointees. And there's a new thing that President Trump tried to begin implementing at the end of his last term, this is in 2020, that President Biden immediately overturns, that we might see return, and that's Schedule F. So President Trump creates a unilateral action, something called Schedule F, that is a way for the president to increase the number of political appointees in the federal bureaucracy, going from about 4,000 to as many as 40,000. The cool thing about Schedule F, and the great thing for all of us, is that there's a lot of unknowns. We don't know what's going to happen with Schedule F. We don't know how many people this could affect. President Trump asked for the number at the end of his term, the number of people who would have important policymaking roles. And these are the people he wants to take control of. It's not the person who is handing your social security check or the person who is delivering your mail. He wants people in these policy positions specifically. And so he asked these individuals, and there's about 40,000 of them that he identified that we think could be individuals that would be replaced under Schedule F, which means these roles are currently civil servants. Some of you here may decide to pursue a career in the civil service. It's an awesome pathway. You have great job protection, but it's kind of hard to get a job in the civil service. You have to take an exam. You have to be highly qualified for the role you're in, especially in a high policy, one of these higher policy making roles. And so these individuals who may have had their job for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And so he'd be replacing these individuals with political appointees that he can use at his discretion. I say might because we do not have a good idea of one, how many people, but also if this is legal or not. So the Supreme Court never had a chance to rule on this because it was put in at the end of his term and immediately rescinded by when President Biden took office. So we don't have a large idea, but it's something to keep an eye on when President Trump is inaugurated in January. Will he decide to kind of reinstate Schedule F via executive order, and how far will this get? Will he begin to remove these civil servants, or will we see a situation wherein the courts step in and pause everything, freeze these actions, and decide to rule against this by chance? There's one third thing I want to think about. If you change out 40,000 people and you remove them from office, that's a lot of people. You now have to hire 40,000 people. It's really hard. Some people here have been on search committees. It's very hard to find people to fill roles for jobs. And so what does this look like? What does this mean for the federal bureaucracy? It might mean that we have a lot of vacancies. We have a lot of positions sitting vacant. So the 4,000 that we currently have in appointees, we already have kind of a large number of vacancies that remain sometimes for the entirety of the president's term. There's a whole literature on why you leave something vacant, why it makes be strategic to do so, or the time calculus that goes into this, not only for the president, but for the Senate, who has to now hear these nominees and confirm them if required. And so this could mean that we not only have 40,000 appointees, but what might be more concerning is that we have large numbers of positions that are completely unfilled. Now, when we have unfilled positions, the concerning thing that arises is that work stops. You don't have somebody doing that job. Now you don't have anybody actually doing the day-to-day. And so this really upsets the federal bureaucracy. It upsets your day-to-day work. It upsets rulemaking that happens there, and it upsets law implementation. So these are the few of the things related to control over the federal bureaucracy that President Trump might be thinking about and that we should all be thinking about in the coming year, in few years. But we really are going to see a lot of this action likely kind of right at the beginning of the term, whether this is gonna happen or not happen. So to leave you, Professor Shilkrow was like, leave on something that's maybe not like the federal bureaucracy is going to like crumble because there's no employees in it. There are checks on the president. The president cannot act alone. The president is in a system with other individuals who can check him, namely Congress. And we've started to see these things. People may say Congress is weak, Congress doesn't want to do its job. That's not necessarily true. Congress does do a job and it does play a role, and we're seeing that right now. So some of you may have had concerns about Matt Gaetz being Attorney General due to some investigations that were going on in the House. And Matt Gaetz met with senators, and senators, even Republican senators, said, I don't feel comfortable appointing this person to this position. This is the check. Now Congress is checking the president and saying, we don't feel comfortable having this person in this role. We're not willing to appoint them. And we're hopefully going to see similar things moving forward, that Congress has institutional responsibility and institutional power to actually be able to do these things. And so it's gonna be the responsibility of other branches to check the president, who might want to bring a bureaucracy completely under his control, or might want to leave a bureaucracy without folks in it to let it, be have a hard time working and functioning. So hopefully we will see some great separation of powers government coming up in the next 4 years.
Thank you very much. President Drew, you're next.
Am I standing or sitting?
Whichever you prefer.
What do you all want?
Stand.
Oh my God, okay, great. Good evening, everyone. And so, obviously on, the front that I do, so I teach two courses here at Tufts. One is on US state government and politics. So we look at how states are structured and state relations with different levels of government. The other one is called The Art of Good Trouble, and that's of course on policy, politics, and organizing. Yeah, it's on. And so when it comes to state-federal relations, there's a few things to look at. So obviously you alluded to some stuff that's in the news right now around immigration. I think there's going to be well, one, there are a lot of unknowns. I don't know logistically how you deport possibly 20 million undocumented people. In Massachusetts, there are roughly 200,000 undocumented immigrants. About 20% of the population in Massachusetts is foreign born. And so there's definitely some anxiety that's looming in the air, but thinking about how you actually logistically do that, I don't know. So we're seeing Democratic mayors and Democratic governors across the country right now. They're banding together. I don't think that you're going to see sort of the resistance that you saw in the first Trump term. You're not going to see women's marches or those sorts of things. Democrats are taking a very different approach right now to President Trump. They're a bit more calculated. They're thinking more on the front of lawsuits and other political challenges. Clearly, they're at a huge disadvantage in the Congress right now, so there's not a lot of power among Democrats. So for them, there's still a lot of bureaucratic, parliamentary maneuvers that they can actually leverage within the Congress. But I think we're going to see an increased role for the states. And so when it comes to immigration, for instance, when it comes to abortion, reproductive rights, when it comes to science, technology, and infrastructure, things like that, we're going to see states that are going to take up more. One of the things that really concerns me from a financial perspective, and this should be on your mind, given here we're at a university, Trump, Project 2025, the Republican agenda to attack higher education, to attack certain institutions like the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes for Health, the CDC, others. A lot of these agencies fund universities and other research institutions. So, universities like Tufts benefit enormously. If any of you are majoring in the sciences or double majoring in some STEM field, some of that funding is coming from the feds. California, Massachusetts, other states are benefiting enormously from federal packages that the Biden administration passed, including the Chips and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, et cetera. You're talking about roads, bridges, other critical infrastructure projects that might get held up, that might get delayed. Oddly enough, a lot of those projects in the Biden administration actually benefited Republican-leaning states. And so I am curious to see how much of the saber rattling is actually implemented or if it's politicized. And so, does the Trump administration go after, the states that are more blue, the states like Illinois and Colorado, whose governors are banding together and creating, their own governor's caucus, if you will, to try to resist Trump, or is there sort of a unilateral across the board, we're just going to defund everything? We don't know. There's a lot that we don't know, so I would watch this space. When it comes to Other issues like reproductive rights, this again is going to be an area where you're going to see a lot of states leaning in more. Obviously, abortion was on the ballot in 10 states this month. That may continue to be the case in the coming few years, so that's another area to look at and see what are states doing to insulate themselves. You're seeing governors that are banding together now to think through, Governor of Massachusetts convened a cabinet meeting the day after Trump was elected. Governor of Maryland convened a cabinet meeting the weekend after Trump was elected. The governor of California has convened a special session of the California State Assembly. So, start to pay attention to those things and see what are governors doing right now and in the long term. My friends in the Biden administration tell me that they are just trying to distribute as much money as possible in the coming 8 or so weeks. And so there are a lot of projects that are trying to be funded. I actually have one of my clients that's waiting for $1 million from FEMA. So, hopefully we get that in the next 2 weeks, because otherwise we will be out of luck, as they say. So that's another thing to watch for. The other thing that I would say that for me, I find interesting when it comes to the incoming administration, that I think is going to play out, whether it's in college campuses or just in states as a whole, is sort of on the so-called culture wars side of things. What sort of tone and messaging are we going to see from the White House and from the administration? Check out to earlier point on the 4,000 federal appointees. We're already beginning to see who some of these cabinet officials may be. Secretary of Education doesn't really have an education background. I don't really know what's going on there. There's several billionaires that are going to be in the cabinet. This is going to be a cabinet with very high net worth. So that's something to look at. But with that, what is the tone that's going to be set? Economically, one thing that really concerns me is this, proposed tariffs and the threats there of these, trade wars. Is that saber rattling or is that real? Part of me thinks it's not real because there are a lot of billionaires that may be in the cabinet and their Wall Street friends are going to be pretty upset with some of this. And so I don't know if some of this stuff is actually going to happen. The other thing that I would say in terms of the previous Trump administration with the COVID pandemic, during the height of the pandemic, especially early days, where there wasn't really federal leadership, we didn't really know what was going on. You remember there were states that were competing over PPE, there were states that were competing over toilet paper. I mean, it was pretty Lord of the Flies in the early days. And so one of the things to think about is how are we going to see if there is some sort of other national emergency that comes up, whether it is a public health emergency or a natural disaster. Will there be any federal leadership? Will there be a weaponization of federal institutions? Will federal institutions exist? Will they be staffed fully to respond to these issues? This is something to also consider. In the early days, what we saw was there was no coordination with COVID, and so there were truly 50 different strategies to combat the pandemic. And it wasn't really until the vaccine rollout came about that governors actually started coordinating. So for instance, in New England, all the New England governors plus New York and the tri-state area started coordinating on vaccine rollout. But before that, there wasn't really a lot of coordination. One of my favorite examples was Bob Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots, flew in an airplane, one of the Patriots airplanes, with a bunch of PPE. And in order to ensure that there was no theft, there was actually a state police escort. Like that's how crazy the early days were. And so in certain states there wasn't even state leadership. So in some states, including in Ohio and in California and North Carolina, a lot of these regulations, particularly around evictions and whatnot, were done at the county or local level. So there wasn't really a lot of uniformity. So that's another thing to look at over the next few years. Hopefully there is no major emergency, but we again don't know. One other thing to note on the U.S.-Africa front, for those of you, I think IR is co-sponsoring this, few things to note there. So first and foremost, there isn't really a lot of attention given to Africa in general. I would say in the next few weeks, pay attention if Biden actually visits Africa. He had promised earlier in his term to visit Africa. We're in this sort of post-election lame duck period, so one could argue that President Biden has a little bit more time on his hands. And so maybe he does visit Africa, who knows? But, in general, Africa doesn't really get that much attention. And when it does, it's usually in the sort of lens of counterterrorism and humanitarian issues. But we saw in the first Trump term, there was a shifting away from that. There was a decreased attention given to Africa in the Trump term. There was also a decrease in funding for humanitarian issues. So does that come out again? There are some Republicans, particularly those who back Project 2025, that want to do away with the U.S. Agency for International Development, want to defund the State Department. And so that's something to look at. And we know in the first Trump term, there were a lot of vacancies, very critical vacancies, bureaus and offices that were left vacant in the State Department and in other offices. So that may be a thing that comes up again in the second term. So when it comes to Africa, I think what we're going to see is a lot more of a transactional approach to the continent, which actually oddly might be good for the continent when it comes to trade and investment issues. There may be a more emphasis placed on deal making, and so how can we get American companies to go to Africa and maximize their profit, and how do we get good deals in return here? There are some trade pacts that we do have with the continent, namely the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. And so, does that get renewed? Are there other deals that the president wants to sign? I don't know, but that's something worth looking at. We still don't know who some of those key sub-cabinet appointees are going to be, so there's still a big question mark there. But that's something I would definitely flag for you. What we did see, though, in the first Trump term was when it came to Middle East and Africa. Professor Mufti will talk more about this, is sort of more emphasis on these peace deals with the Abraham Accords and others. And so there was a lot more of a transactional approach there, and that may be the case for Africa too. So I would just say that's another space to watch. But ultimately, I am looking forward to renewed cooperation between states. I think that's going to be a good thing. I think we'll see a lot more collaboration among states. However, that also may translate into more of I don't want to use the word war, but that may end up being a combative relationship with the federal government. So Democrats may end up being on the front line of keeping the federation together and maintaining states' rights, which isn't really verbiage that Democrats use, but that may end up being the next thing over the 4 years. So I'd say just watch that space, and we'll talk more in the Q&A. Thank you.
And I really appreciate people thinking about what are the things that I'm a little optimistic about possibly, and seeing states as sites of another check in the complex system that we have. All right, Professor Mufti, you're up.
Thank you. I think I'll begin by just saying a few words about the implications for the region of the new administration, and then pivot back to the implications for American politics of the Middle East. It seems likely, given President Trump's generally non-interventionist attitude to foreign policy, that his elections is emboldening illiberal regimes in the region, ranging from the many Arab dictatorships to Benjamin Netanyahu's in Israel. That seems pretty clear. So the prospects for democratization, liberalization are not likely to be getting a boost from the United States in the next 4 years. It also doesn't seem likely that President Trump is going to promote any resolution to the Palestinian conflict that will be anywhere near satisfactory to the Palestinian people. And that fact is broadly significant for two reasons that come back to the United States. The first implication of that for U.S. foreign policy, and the second implication of that for U.S. domestic politics. It's long been a major theme in my classes that on the Middle East, that outbreaks of conflict relating to Palestine usually have a negative impact on U.S. interests. Right? That conflict creates divisions among U.S. allies, other U.S. allies, that create opportunities for challengers to U.S. dominance in the region to make inroads, such as the Russians, such as more recently the Iranians, etc. And they also provide a useful platform for regional attempt to change the status quo, to expand the regional influence of mid-range regional actors, again, like Iran since the 1980s, but we've seen Egypt in the 1950s and 60s, Syria and Iraq in the 1970s, maybe Turkey more recently, right? So in general, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian conflict, is a gift that keeps on giving to the adversaries of the United States. In March 2010, the then CENTCOM commander, General David Petraeus, told the Senate Armed Services Committee, quote, enduring hostilities between Israel and some of its neighbors present distinct challenges to our ability to advance our interests in the area of responsibility. Arab anger over the Palestinian question limits the strength and depth of US partnerships with governments and peoples in the region, unquote. So the Trump administration's likely failure to move forward with any kind of resolution to this conflict is going to probably negatively impact US interests in the region. But the second reason, and that's been a case for a long time, the second implication is new, however. Palestine, I will argue to you or suggest to you, is now having a serious effect on US domestic politics as well, radicalizing it just as it has radicalized Middle Eastern politics. We see this in the shift that's taking place among Arab and Muslim Americans, as well as their supporters. Some striking statistics. In Dearborn, Michigan, President Biden had gotten 69% of the vote in 2020. This year, Harris got 36%, now 69 to 36%. Behind President Trump's astonishing 43% of the Arab and Muslim American vote in Dearborn, Michigan. Nationally, according to exit polling by the Council on Arab Islamic Relations, 53% of Muslim Americans voted for Trump, 21% voted for Harris, and only 20% voted for, what did I say? 53% for Stein, 21% for Trump, and only 20% for Harris. This is not obviously by itself a decisive factor in the overall outcome of the election, for all kinds of other reasons, but it is clearly a factor in President Trump's victory. And moreover, while we have to wait to see more accurate figures, there seems to have been a shift towards Trump also among certain segments of the Jewish American electorate as well. According to Fox News exit polls, for example, Harris won 55% of the Jewish vote in New York State, which is down from 69% for Biden 4 years ago, while Trump increased his vote from 30% in 2020 to 45% this year. And you can point to remarkably narrow Democratic victories in states like New Jersey, Illinois, Nevada, Arizona, and Pennsylvania that would also seem to back up this suggestion. So to find these results, the outcome of the elections, and the general drift of American politics concerning for American democracy, that leads to the further suggestion that maybe a just resolution in Palestine will help not only America's foreign policy, but perhaps domestic political health as well. And maybe that's something many of us here can agree on.
Thank you. Professor Shell.
Professor Schildkraut, you were saying you want some optimistic news. I don't think I'll be able to deliver any. But it's not all gloom and doom. So let me address, so I am here to speak primarily about the Russia-Ukraine war and implications of the elections for what might come or what might not come. As you probably all know, sort of very generally speaking, in Ukraine, they were rather hoping for Harris victory, and in Russia, they were hoping for Trump victory. So on the face of it, it looks like, things are sort of looking to Russia. But actually, if you start looking a little bit closer, there is maybe less sort of optimism than one might think in Moscow, and maybe less pessimism than one might think in Kyiv. And there are some reasons for it.
Michael's daughter made an appearance. No laughing at the war.
My cat sometimes walks across with his tail, so okay. So let me kind of say a couple of words about this video. So it seems like now most people think, and I would admit that sort of I'm increasingly puzzled by what I hear, that almost everybody seems to think that some kind of deal is imminent. And I may be totally wrong. I already told my class, like, remember that, better be wrong than vague. But I actually see big obstacles to the conclusion of any kind of deal over in the war in Ukraine. And let me explain why that is the case. So when we think about possible settlements, I think the likelihood of the deal greatly depends, or sort of one's thinking about the likelihood of the deal. I think greatly depends on one's thinking about the ultimate causes of this war. And if one believes, as many do, that really sort of what Russia really cares about, it's NATO, it's sort of NATO coming to its borders and its security. And therefore, if you satisfy it on this dimension, if there is some kind of promise done, in particular by the US, and Trump, of course, doesn't care about NATO particularly, if at all, that say, they say, okay, Ukraine is not going to be in NATO, be it for 20 years or forever. And then, additionally, Russia gets to keep to sort of de facto control the territory that it has occupied so far. And then, Ukraine can sort of be allowed to exist in its the territory that the government currently controls, and receives, some sort of, it's not going to receive NATO membership, but it is going to receive, some security assistance, basically to be able to defend itself. That's kind of like an all-around good. And that's sort of what many seems to think, and to the extent we've seen something from the Trump administration, that seems to be sort of the way they're thinking about, at least people talk about the deal this way as well. Now, the problem becomes that this sort of thinking assumes, right, that really what this war is about is Ukraine's potential membership in NATO, and Russia is concerned about it, and we can sort of have it both ways, that everybody's happy, and yes, Ukraine ultimately lost some territory, but it can exist as a state. But I would posit, and this is something that, again, scholars of Ukraine would agree with me, or most of them at least will, that this is not what this war is ultimately about. So this war is really ultimately about Russia's control of Ukraine in total, be it through occupation or through puppet government, in such a way that Ukraine actually doesn't have a sovereignty, that it is not a viable state, that it is basically at best some sort of version of Belarus, where it is nominally sovereign, but in reality doesn't have any sovereignty at all. And that's really what Putin wants, because if it was just about NATO, I don't have time now, but let me tell you that there is plenty of evidence that Ukraine was not going to be in NATO. Putin knew this, everybody knew this, and sort of to go to war to prevent something from happening that is not really was going to happen anyway, this is not why he went. And then if we look at specific claims he's been making, what is it that he actually wants? He had actually made it pretty clear. He had, first of all, began by saying that to the extent any kind of clear goal was articulated, that was the liberation, quote unquote, of Donbass, which they still do not control. Yes, they made some territorial advances, but they're still pretty far from regaining control of entire of this East Ukrainian region. They have been losing to the tune of like 1,500 people a day. Whether they can sustain the space, Ukraine has its own problems, not to sort of say that there is a rosy picture there, but basically liberation of Donbass has not been achieved, so the line of conflict is frozen, like there goes this goal. Now, to reflect realities on the ground, meaning Putin, of course, doesn't want to give up any occupied territory, but Ukraine controls part of Russia's Kursk Oblast, right? What about that? So Russian territorial, that's supposed to be under nuclear doctrine and all of this, is now been occupied for now, what is it, going on 3 months by Ukrainian forces. They now, got all these North Koreans to try to get it back by Trump inauguration. So far, it doesn't seem to be going all that well. Now, if they don't manage to liberate it, sort of that's yet another obstacle. And then furthermore, to the point of wanting to control Ukraine, Putin talked about, and he continues to talk about, so-called denazification and demilitarization. What does it really mean? Denazification basically means having a government in Kyiv that would do what Putin wants. That's really what it means, because otherwise everybody is a Nazi. And demilitarization means that Ukraine basically does not have a functioning army and is not able to defend itself. Again, he had made it very clear, this so-called deal that supposedly was almost reached in Istanbul, there was no deal. And one of the main obstacles was that Putin wanted a veto on security guarantees to Ukraine in reduced borders, which is sort of no-go for the government in Kyiv. Now, the question becomes, what would Trump do? So, and here, I talked to some colleagues and we have a disagreement there, because some of my colleagues think that Trump would basically willing to just give Putin everything he wants to sort of play a deal. I'm not so sure, because it's one thing to sort of come out of it as a good deal maker. It's another thing to just roll over to Putin and say, like, take everything you want. And I don't really see indications that Putin is willing to take less, right? I think he does think that they can outlast Ukraine, they can outlast the West, they can outspend the West. Things are not going great there, either in the economy or on the battlefield, but it's not sort of at the point of imminent collapse. And again, the stakes are so high, he went to this war, he staked his legacy on reclaiming, whatever he considers real Russian territory. I was just at a panel at the Slavic Studies Conference in Boston, and somebody quoted this Russian foreign minister who said Putin has 3 advisors, Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, and Ivan the Terrible. If that's what he's taking his advice from, right, any kind of like a bit of ruined Ukrainian Eastern Donbass is not going to satisfy. So sort of the question then becomes, right, is this kind of deal likely or feasible? I'm not gonna say that it's definitely won't happen, but I do want to suggest that it is actually gonna be much higher than, many say. And then the question becomes sort of how much Trump is willing to give, and given how unpredictable he is as a person, as a leader, I don't think we really have any idea. And then additionally, if say he were to just, give Putin everything he wants, which I think is a big question mark, then the question becomes how do Europeans respond? How do Ukrainians respond? I mean, I just talked to some military experts who were saying that Ukraine has enough to hold on at least until sort of middle of next year, even under the worst case circumstance. Would Poland, would the Poles, would the Finns, the UK just let it basically be run over and sort of Putin march to Kiev, the front line to collapse. So I think these are all big uncertainties. So I'm just sort of want to kind of throw this food for thought. Whenever you hear that the deal is imminent, kind of think about these things. And the last thing maybe I'll mention, because that will probably come up in the questions, what about these new weapons? Are we now at the point of, nuclear escalation, and what sort of use? I mean, I want to start with an anecdote, and that not to make light of it, but in Ukraine, there is this meme, when are we going to Shchekovitsa? What is Shchekovitsa? Shchekovitsa is a hill in Kyiv that has some pagan significance. And the joke is that before nuclear, war starts, we're all going to have an orgy there, right? So there's going to be like a big orgy of Shchekovitsa, who's going, like when are we gathering, that kind of stuff. Now, on a more serious note, people in Ukraine are not particularly concerned about escalation. And the argument is, you're laughing about it. I can send you the name. It's hard to pronounce. Shchekovitsa. You can email me. I'm going to spell it out.
I will Google this.
Yes. Ukraine has been pounded by any kind of weapon, from Shahid drones to the ballistic, sonic, you name it, any missile, and people are like, whatever they threw at us yesterday is not that different. Now, I am no military expert. I can't say, I don't know if whatever missile that they was used, and there was some confusion as to what sort of missile was used, if it is sort of changes things militarily. In other words, can they hit something they couldn't hit before, and so forth. It seems to be some conflicting information there. Putin, of course, claimed he appeared today after more than 2 week absence, and already internet exploded with the fact that his hands have not moved 1 millimeter. Was that an AI image for real Putin? I don't know that either. But the point about the missile is that he claims that it cannot be shot by any kind of air defense, what have you, but they've claimed that about previous weapons too that have been shot. So sort of long short of it is that I think it's more posturing and really counting on the West being intimidated, because that has worked really well. And as far as, people in Ukraine, they sort of understand the thing better. It's hard to quantify, but it is a mentality of a bully, really. And, the bully backs off when the bully is faced with strength. So on that note, maybe we will all gather on Shchekovitsa, or we can find some good hill here, but I'll end at that optimistic note, right?
President Bagley, you're on.
Sorry for the guest speakers that were trying to come in there. I'll be really quick, because I think Trump's China policy is basically going to be an extension of the Biden policy, which was itself an extension of the original Trump China policy. And that simply reflects the fact that containing China is one of the few truly bipartisan issues, because China has just seemingly angered pretty much every constituency. The national security hawks are freaked out about Chinese militarization. China's churning out weapons at 5 to 6 times the rate of the United States. It's the largest military buildup in peacetime of any country since Nazi Germany. Human rights activists are upset about China, about the Uyghurs, Tibetans, etc. Labor hates China because of the massive subsidies that China has pumped into its manufacturing industries and then sent this glut of exports onto global markets. Environmentalists are all up in arms. If you just look at CO2 emissions coming out of China, they've skyrocketed. And then internationalists are obviously very concerned about China's menacing of allies around East Asia. And you just see this reflected in American public opinion. More than 80% of Americans view China unfavorably. It was already climbing that way. And then COVID came. And the fact that China won't even allow an investigation into where COVID came from, I think has just really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And the opinion polls also show that more than half of Americans consider China's power and influence a major threat. So at this point, it's, there's a general recognition that this is a major issue. And so you actually have a fair amount of continuity. And if you just look at Trump's cabinet picks so far, I mean, Rubio, he was one of the co-chairs of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which was this very hawkish committee that really monitored Chinese human rights practices and its militarization, et cetera. Michael Waltz, not Walls, but Waltz, he was appointed, he's probably going to be the national security advisor. He's a congressperson, and as a congressperson, he consistently advocated for a very robust U.S. economic and military response to China. Robert Lighthizer is going to be this trade czar. I don't even know what his title is going to be, but in the previous Trump administration, he was the trade representative that basically orchestrated the tariffs that were slapped across the board on Chinese goods. And then John Ratcliffe is probably going to be the CIA director, and he's really emphasized the need to counter China's espionage. He's been making a big stink about the fact that China has seeded malware in a lot of U.S. critical infrastructure. And so I think that'll be a big part of his sell. So when I look at just the various prongs of U.S. policy towards China, I just see an extension and probably an intensification of what has already been going on over the last, 8 to 12 years, really since the second half of the second Obama term, where, I've talked to some of these officials and they basically just became completely apoplectic about China because they felt like they had offered sort of an olive branch. They had hosted Xi Jinping at the White House. He promised not to militarize the South China Sea or engage in espionage, and then proceeded to do all of those things. And so the second half of the second Obama term really started to get much more aggressive towards China. Then Trump obviously took that into high gear, and then Biden basically ratified everything that Trump put in place. So when you look at, for example, on the economic restrictions, in Trump's first term, he slaps 25% tariffs on most Chinese goods. Then Biden maintains those and actually expands a lot of the investment and tech restrictions on China, especially on computer chips. I think Trump is definitely going to increase those tariffs as soon as he gets into office, in part because China has actually been ramping up its subsidies to its companies. And so it's not just going to be the United States. You're going to see more tariffs coming from the EU as well as Japan, just because many countries' trade deficits have really expanded greatly just in the last couple of years alone because of these massive subsidies coming out of China. I also expect further investment restrictions. The Biden administration talked about this idea of we want a small yard, but a high fence around it. So pick a few technologies and protect those. I think Trump is going to greatly expand. It's going to be a golf course sized yard that he's going to have in terms of the technologies that are going to be protected. He's also going to go after a lot of American companies and especially Wall Street, because that was one of the loopholes, was that even though the United States cut off certain technologies to China, a lot of money was just flowing in from Wall Street and American VCs into Chinese military and tech firms. I think that's going to be severely curtailed under Trump. And then I would expect him, because he was elected on this multiracial working class coalition, and he's all about America first. I would expect him to pair this with more what are effectively subsidies to American manufacturing industries to encourage supply chain decoupling from China and hopefully reshoring in the United States as he sees it. Security policy, I would characterize the Biden policy as a lot of loud talk while carrying a relatively small stick. When he got into office, he said, America is back. He said on at least 5 occasions, the United States would defend Taiwan militarily if China attacked. That's actually an expansion on existing U.S. Taiwan policy. Our official policy had always been strategic ambiguity. We're not going to tell anyone what we might do, but we will certainly view it as a grave offense if China assaults Taiwan. But he just straight up said, no, we're going to defend them no matter what. And he also couched all of this in terms of this epic struggle between democracies and autocracy. But then when it came time to actually fund the military, he submitted defense budgets that were so low, they were decreases when you account for inflation. And Congress had to routinely increase the amount that was put into the defense budget just because people thought it was so shockingly low. Even today, it's at 2.7% of GDP, which is the same as it was in the lovely 1990s, and the same as it was in the 1930s, which a lot of people regard as a period of American isolationism. So it was this sort of global primacy, but on an America first budget. I think Trump will try to rectify some of that. So you'll see a defense budget increase. You'll see much greater investment in drones. The Pentagon has this thing called Project Replicator, where they basically just want to turn the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea into this high-tech minefield where you just have all these high-tech drones basically sitting out there ready to sink Chinese ships. I think Trump is going to pump that full of money. The ironic thing, though, is that when it comes to defending Taiwan, I think that might actually be an area of difference between current policy and in the future. So I think a lot of the China hawks in Trump's administration think containing China means defending Taiwan. And so they're going to be in favor of a staunch defense of that. But you never know with Trump. I think it's not a foregone conclusion because Trump doesn't seem to like war. He likes coercive bargaining. But I get the sense that he's not really ready to ignite what could be World War III over Taiwan. And he's famously said on multiple occasions during his first term, you know, he would often point to the Resolute desk, that giant desk in the Oval Office, and say, "This is China." And then he'd point to like his little Sharpie pen and he'd say, "And this is Taiwan." And at one point he said to a senator, you know, if this big thing invades that, China is just a few miles away from Taiwan. We're like 8,000 miles away. There's not a fucking thing that we can do about it. Those were his exact words to a senator. So not exactly conveying a lot of confidence. And so my guess on Taiwan policy is he'll come in and posture as a staunch defender of Taiwan because it's his opening gambit in terms of negotiating with the Chinese. It also, that's just kind of his MO, is trying to look tough. But I just wonder if China blockades Taiwan, which, by the way, they did a dress rehearsal for a few months ago. I'm not so sure that Trump is going to send the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command into war and start ordering them to sink Chinese ships. So that is an area that I see as one of great uncertainty. The last thing I'll say is just on alliances. So the Biden team was all about alliances. I was actually in my PhD program with several members of Biden's National Security Council. And even then, they were like all about, we just need to build alliances in East Asia. And that's basically exactly what they've done. So you had AUKUS, which linked Australia, the UK, and the United States, and basically equipped Australia with these long-range missiles that make them a player now in any South China Sea conflict. You had the resurrection of the Quad, which links together Japan, India, Australia, and the United States, with the idea of like you're surrounding China at the four corners of the compass in Asia with this alliance. You had a trilateral agreement between South Korea, Japan, and the United States, which is really important because the South Koreans hate the Japanese because of the brutality that the Japanese inflicted on them in the 20th century. And so getting them to mend ties is really important just from a security perspective because it allows military interoperability and cooperation in sanctions. And then on the Philippines, you know, in 2016, the Philippines was leaning towards China. And you actually had the Philippine leader talking about scuttling the U.S. alliance and kicking the Americans out. Now, under Biden, you've had a resurrection of that relationship, and they've opened up all these new military bases and really reaffirmed the alliance. I think Trump will probably build on these just because it's such a strategic advantage. But he does have this America First ethos. And in his first term, he slapped tariffs on friend and foe alike. And so maybe it's entirely possible he could do that again. He also basically tried to turn some of these alliances into protection rackets. So he went to the South Koreans, he went to the Japanese and said, "You got to pay us $5 billion more for the troops that we have on your soil," which, by the way, they already pay the room and board for. It's actually cheaper to station American troops there than it is on the continental United States because they subsidize their rent. But he said, "No, you got to pay us even more. We want $5 billion more for the protection that we are giving you." So that, you know, that's always going to be a part of his personality, the sort of real estate mogul negotiator. So I can't rule out him coming in, looking at this groundwork that has been laid by my former classmates and just saying, "You know what, here's some tariffs. And by the way, you got to pay. Otherwise, we're not going to protect you." The last thing, I mean, I'll defer to Oksana on this. I do worry about a major shift in Europe that actually impacts Asia. I'm a firm believer that the rebalance to Asia has to go through Europe, because if you're truly going to take on China, you really need to have a multinational coalition that spans Eurasia. If for no other reason, you need it on the economic front to have the big European powers on your side. But I don't think it's out of the question that Trump, you know, pressures Ukraine or abandons Ukraine. I just look at, there's a lot of Asia firsters in his administration, people that have long been saying the main battleground, our main adversary is China. The Europeans should be able to handle Russia. Ukraine is not a strategic interest of the United States. So we need to roll this thing up and throw everything into Asia. So I can't rule out that he will do that. I'm reasonably confident that once you get in the Oval Office and you see the map and all the conflicts going on, and you get the intelligence reports about everything that Putin is doing, you'll start to think differently. But I mean, I don't know, because I look at some of the people in his administration and they've long been saying, you know, why are we sending these weapons to Ukraine? So on that happy note, I'll turn it back over to the panel. Thanks very much.
Thank you for modeling the joyful chaos of work life.
That's why my children talk a lot about Putin and Xi Jinping in their kindergarten and first grade classes. But it really doesn't go beyond the fact that they think Xi Jinping looks like Winnie the Pooh. So they troll him on a regular basis, which I'm totally fine with.
As long as they don't repeat the quote from Trump with the curse word.
I forgot about the earmuffs for that.
All right, so I'll say a few words that relate to my research areas, and then we will open it up for questions. We are just shy of 7 o'clock and we have the room till 8, so we've got plenty of time to continue and hear what's on your mind. So I do research on public opinion and political behavior, a lot of public opinion related to immigration. I'm not an immigration policy scholar, but since the election and leading up to it, I've been paying a lot of attention to people who I respect in this area and what they think is likely to happen on immigration policy. And I'll say, if you haven't taken a look at the New York Times today, there is an excellent op-ed in today's New York Times by Dara Lind, who's a journalist who her specialty is immigration, and she wrote an op-ed on kind of what we might expect moving forward. And it's really thorough and really clear. And that seems to be the emerging consensus that I'm seeing is, you know, kind of a low-hanging fruit approach is very likely. So focusing immigration enforcement efforts on people who are already in the court system, people maybe already who have a criminal record, people who are relatively easy to identify and find, as opposed to the mass deportations going door to door, in addition to like the infrastructure needed for that, the personnel needed for that, needing agreements of where to send people and place people, that being less likely. I wouldn't be surprised if we see some versions of travel bans like what Trump had in his first administration. And in fact, I heard on the news the other day that the UMass Amherst administration, I believe it was UMass Amherst, might have been the whole system, but they sent out advice to their international students and faculty. If you are traveling for Christmas break, our Christmas break, you know, our winter break ends after inauguration, you might want to make your travel plans so that you're back before he's inaugurated. So that is a chilling message, but something we may hear here at Tufts. So if you are an international student, you may want to be thinking about your travel plans, because that was one of the first things he did when he was inaugurated the first time, was restrict travel into the United States as a form of immigration enforcement, separate from addressing immigrants who are already here. And then I'll just briefly say, you know, some of you have taken classes with me, have heard me talk about some of this stuff already, but on the public opinion and political engagement front, one of the things I like to say since Trump came on the national scene as a politician is we still don't know what about politics he's broken, in terms of like, we don't have many laws in political science. We study complex people in complex environments. It's not like, you know, physics or, you know, water always boils at 212 degrees, that there aren't that many laws for us, but we do have a few that we like to think of as being laws. And there are two that are on my mind these days. And again, we don't know if Trump is going to break them, but he didn't break them the last time. So one of them is that the president's party always loses seats in midterm elections. So in terms of public opinion, it's a mistake to interpret presidential election outcomes as this is the public wants everything he was talking about. The election was close. The popular vote margin was very, very close. People vote the way they do for all sorts of complicated reasons. And it's just hard to imagine that the American public as a whole, their desires overwhelmingly change so much from one extreme to another in such a short span of time. And so what happens is often there's some enthusiasm in different parts of the American public about some of each different parts of the campaign, but then the reality of governing sets in. And in midterm elections, there's no presidential ticket. There isn't all the hubbub of the national attention. And it's often the case that the opposition is maybe a little more motivated, a little more enthusiastic. Some people who did vote for Republicans in 2024 might think, oh, I had been on the fence and now maybe so the House margin is really, really small also. And so I think, you know, if the laws hold, it would be one thing to look forward, like really looking forward, not just after inauguration, but in the next 2 years, is most political scientists would expect that he has the House for 2 years, right? He will not have, the Republicans will not have the House after the 2026 midterm elections. There are only 2 exceptions in the past 100 years of when the president's party gains seats in midterm elections. The first is 2002, which was right after 9/11, so that makes some sense. There was this patriotic fervor, so there was still a lot of rally around the flag. So 2002, and then the other one was, of all years, 1998, when the House was trying to impeach Bill Clinton. And what's been in the air since this election is, well, you know, Biden's approval rating was so unpopular, so there were all these headwinds for Harris that were hard for her to overcome. Well, in 1998, I mean, Clinton's approval rating was like in the 60s, his entire presidency, if not higher. I mean, people just loved the guy when he was in office. And so there was actually a backlash against the attempts to impeach him in 1998. So those were 2 kind of weird years. It's been, 100 years of president's parties losing seats during midterm election. Will 2026 be a weird year? It's always possible, but the odds are favoring that that there will be mobilization, and that mobilization will work for 2026 midterms. And then related to that, on a lot of the particular issues, you know, while I just said the public as a whole doesn't adopt wholesale everything one candidate says and then reject it 4 years later, there is evidence that the public as a whole does move a little between elections. And so in my public opinion class, we talk about this theory called thermostatic public opinion, which is the idea that we can think of the public as like changing the thermostat from cold to hot, from liberal to conservative. And there have been scholars who study this who collect like kind of all of the policy public opinion data that's been out in a given year, and they calculate on average what percentage of Americans are giving the liberal response to these, and to see like how liberal is the public feeling over time. And if you look at a graph of this over time, it looks like a heartbeat. And they get liberal, they get conservative, they get more liberal, they get more conservative. And it tracks with presidential elections. So one of the most conservative moods on this graph over time since we've had public opinion polling is 1980, right when Reagan was elected. And then if you look at they call it the public mood. If you look at the public mood all throughout Reagan's presidency, it gets more and more liberal and more and more liberal. And then there's the first Bush presidency, and then we elect Clinton at a high point. And then the public starts dipping down a little bit throughout his, and it's gradual, but it goes and it continues. And so when I say like, what is Trump going to break in the laws of American politics? Well, he didn't break it the last time. If you look at the graph continuing all the way up through 2024, that during Trump's presidency, the public the liberalism of the American public went up, and then we get Biden elected, and then for the first couple of years of the Biden presidency, it starts to dip back down a little bit. So that's another thing to look for is, again, does it seem to be, so again, it's not drastic swings, but it's kind of like if you ever, if any of you live off campus and control thermostat, you're like, oh, I made it too hot, and now I made it too cold, and you kind of just go back and forth a little bit, and that's kind of what the public seems to do. And so that's another thing to look for is, or a more extreme version is backlash to anything in particular that he does. But these are almost as close as laws as we can get in the study of American political behavior. So those are some of the things that I'm going to be looking for. And with that, I will stop, and I thank you for your patience in listening to us. And for those of you who arrived late, we have food. If you are hungry, we have pizza and drinks. I assume we still have pizza left. And we'll just take questions for whoever you want to ask. Yeah, go ahead. And please speak loudly because we got a big room and I can bring my, yeah, thanks.
I have 2 questions. My first is for you. So, I guess going into 2028, there'll be another time that there will not be double terms on the president. Do you like that could somewhat coincide, some would say, with the development of social media and like publicization of information? Do you think people are so reactionary now that it's gonna be less and less likely for presidents to be able to get a term right after their first term, in a sense? Because of how the approval rating and how people react to their current terms.
So if I understand your question correctly, you're saying if a Democrat wins in 2028, are the odds against that person getting a second term? Oh, boy, do you have thoughts on that? I honestly do not know. It has. The one thing I do know, again, another close thing to get to on American politics is getting 3 terms in a row for a party is really, really unusual. Like after 2 terms of one party in power, like we're done, we're ready for a change. Whether it's just 1 term, I don't know how I would even think about that. So is the reason, so it sounds like you think that might be the case.
I'm just saying that because in my lifetime, I've seen, I guess I saw Obama get elected in 2012, and since then, there hasn't been even a party that has succeeded in a direct term.
Yeah. And I think another thing that makes that question hard to answer is that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. So there's also the electoral college angle to this. So she didn't win, but more Americans wanted what she was offering than Donald Trump at the time. So most Americans wanted a 3rd Democratic term, but they didn't get it.
I would add to that and say that I would take 2020 with a grain of salt because of COVID. I don't know that the backlash was necessary. Like, I don't know if Trump would have lost that election had it not been for COVID, and a very strong response to kind of the lack of federal leadership during a global pandemic, and people felt very strongly about that. And so I think that I don't know that outside of COVID, Trump would have actually lost that election, in which case you would have seen. So I think that like you're looking at kind of some unusual circumstance here, wherein I think that in the future, if we're kind of starting with a clean slate in 2028, because we're gonna have 2 non-incumbents running, because Trump will be at his term limit, and so both sides will be running as, and I think then it's gonna be interesting because you're not gonna have an incumbency advantage, and you're not gonna have any of that weighing you down, but you are kind of, will you pick up the Trump mantle, will you not? I think that this could be an interesting time, and I think that barring another global pandemic, that we might see more of a kind of the typical trends pick up again. Presidents always lose, somewhat in their second term, like in their second election. Obama swept in 2008. He wins handsomely in 2012, does not have the same speed. Same thing, it's just like, you lose some in your midterms. The same things happens in your first election. Now you've been in office, you made promises, you haven't held those promises. And you're gonna be slightly punished for that. But I wouldn't say that like this is like the new normal.
I would also add that, going back to the weirdness, is that you also had Harris, who was the vice president, but basically running sort of as an incumbent, and then she was running against a former president. So it was a very wacky year. So to know what to make of that as a trend, I think there's just gonna be an asterisk next to this election. You wanna? Yes. And was there more to your question?
Well, I had a second.
Okay,
question first. For that's back in Gerber. Am I getting right? Gerber. So you were talking a little bit about Africa, and I've been reading some stuff about Chinese intervention in Africa, and not intervention per se, but just more influence in that sphere. And you were saying Trump is a little bit less interventionist in that sphere, maybe pulling back. How will do either of you see him approaching that realm?
Sorry, so this question was for me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Were you able to hear it?
And how is the question? What? Yeah, I couldn't really hear. So is
China's
how Trump
involvement in
would-
Africa, and how Trump may feel about that.
I don't think Trump cares that much about sub-Saharan Africa. And I think what's happening on the continent in large part is going to make him care even less. I've actually been doing some research on this and looking at the levels of debt distress and political risk in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries. Many of these countries took massive loans from China, but also from other sources, and now are really struggling to pay them back. I saw a shocking statistic that 3.3 billion people now live in countries where interest payments on their debt are greater than what their government is spending on education or healthcare. And most of those countries are in sub-Saharan Africa. And so, you know, China now is in a very difficult position with regard to its Africa policy and really its broader Belt and Road Initiative, because 10 years ago, when it was doling out more than $1 trillion in loans to a lot of these countries, many of which are well below investment grade and have extremely high levels of political risk, everyone loved China because they're handing out free money, and then they're also providing Chinese companies to build infrastructure that otherwise wouldn't have been built. And meanwhile, the World Bank and the IMF are sitting there saying, hey, like, don't you want to work with us still? We know that we ask you to basically become Denmark overnight before we really give you a loan, but like, hey, like we provide high quality loans and we do our due diligence. And a lot of countries said, you know what, thanks, but no thanks. We'll take the easy Chinese money. But now when you fast forward to today, most of those loans are starting to come due, and many of them are not being paid back. And you've already seen China extremely reluctant to offer any kind of debt relief to these countries. So they put Sri Lanka through the ringer. They put Zambia through the ringer, where they basically were saying, yeah, we'll give you some short-term loans to cover the interest that you owe on the existing loans, but we're certainly not going to forgive these debts because we don't want to have to explain to the Chinese people why we sank hundreds of billions of dollars into questionable infrastructure projects in some of these areas. So I actually am extremely worried about debt distress. I'm worried about political unrest. I'm frankly worried in the long term about increasing rates of state failure throughout the developing world. And if you're Donald Trump, you know, and you view the world through a primarily economic and transactional lens, I could see the Trump administration saying, you know what, this is China's issue to deal with. Let's let them clean that up. I saw a remarkable study by some researchers at Harvard that basically showed that China has recreated the 1980s developing world debt crisis. It's a lot of the same countries loaded up with a lot of the same amounts of debt relative to their GDPs. The only difference was back in the 1980s, it was a consortium of dozens of Western banks that had loaned these out. And ultimately they had to just take it in the face. They had to just write off these losses and forgive the debts. The difference today is that China is the main holder of these debts. And so all of the vitriol that was directed towards the World Bank and Western banks in the 1980s, that is all now increasingly turning towards China. I think I could see Robert Lighthizer sitting there as the trade czar and just with a bag of popcorn saying, okay, let's see how this plays out, because China is basically on the hook here and it's going to have to try to figure out a way to do this. The Americans have tried to approach China with multinational debt relief terms, saying, let's figure this out. Let's find ways to kind of move money around. But the Chinese have been reluctant because that would require them to really open up their books. And a lot of the deals that they made with these countries are very opaque. It's hard to find what the actual terms are. And I think they're reluctant to expose some of that dirty laundry. So I don't see the Trump administration upping Biden's Build Back Better World program that was supposed to, you know, create all this aid that ultimately didn't materialize for a lot of these countries. It's hard for me to see Trump, you know, really prioritizing this in any major way.
Yeah, just to add to that, on the World Bank and IMF point, so in the last year, we've seen a few new African countries join BRICS, right? So they've done that, but in the past year, one thing to note, and this is unique because it's a bit of a wartime economy that sank Ethiopia, but it was the World Bank and the IMF that bailed Ethiopia out this year. China was crickets on their end. And so although Ethiopia did join BRICS this year, in the same year, it was the Washington consensus that bailed Ethiopia out. So, you know, I think there's something to be said there. I would actually pay more attention to other countries, including Turkey. Turkey actually has more embassies in Africa than China does at the moment. They're investing more in the continent. Turkish Airlines flies to almost every country in Africa. You know, right now, the sort of biggest Turkish commodity is drones. Their Bayraktar drones are selling pretty hot throughout the continent. And so, you know, there are other countries, not just China, that are definitely competing on the continent, but, you know, the US is nowhere, you know. So I wouldn't necessarily think that we're going to be competing at any level there. You know, we have other things to be worrying about as the US. And so my hope is that, you know, at the very minimum, there isn't any harm that's done. So For me, it's really, how much humanitarian aid is going to get reduced? That's the question. And to be clear, part of the humanitarian aid that the United States sends overseas, especially in Africa, is reproductive health. And so, under Project 2025, that calls for all that to be eliminated. And so, we might see drastic reduction in preventative health and reproductive health in the continent by way of reduction of US aid.
You guys are moderating.
Okay, this is directed to, anyone on the panel, but also, Professor Beckley, because you spoke a little bit about the Uyghur, crisis. I was wondering how, President Trump, you think would approach humanitarian crises, and I know that, the State Department under Mike Pompeo labeled the Uyghur crisis as genocide, but I'm wondering if his approach would change and for any other humanitarian crises around the world.
I don't think so. Although it's hard to say without maybe going case by case, but I think the Uyghur issue, there's a lot of genuine human rights activists, some of which were actually in the Trump administration, but I think Trump himself, as well as someone like Pompeo, their main interest is basically sticking it to China. Their main interest is naming and shaming China. And so when they were giving air to the Uyghur issue, a legitimate human rights issue, I think it was driven overwhelmingly by strategic concerns. So it's hard for me to see that becoming a model that is spread just purely on moral values rather than just strategic interests.
I agree. I don't think that there'll be much. Sorry, yeah, I mean, I'll agree with what Professor Beckley is saying. I don't think there's gonna be much. He's very transactional, right? So in a way, if there is some crisis somewhere that he can sort of get something out of by raising awareness, right? But I don't think that would be like a principal policy of humanitarian.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if there is a conflict between China and the United States will suddenly raise it, the Uyghurs to an international issue. But other than that, no, not on any humanitarian ground.
This question is mostly for the foreign policy members. Do you think we'll see Trump's isolationist rhetoric sort of manifest in policy, or is it more saber rattling? And then also, do you think that we'll see the US under Trump sort of shift responsibility to regional partners like Saudi Arabia to deal with Iran?
Yes, I do think he is not that interested in the nitty-gritty of American foreign policy. I don't think he's going to, he's going to want to, he'd love to have some kind of big public relations kind of events, the Abraham Accords, not nothing. But I don't see him. It's very hard to say because he's so unpredictable. Unless he stumbles into it, I think his instinct is to try to avoid some kind of conflict, direct military conflict with Iran. But he's so easily guidable, in different ways that he could be sucked into it by one or another actor. And so the bottom line with Trump, as far as I'm concerned, is his unpredictability and his lack of strategic or any kind of vision in foreign policy. That's why it's so hard. The last time we had this event 4 years ago, as I recall, Professor Schildkraut, and we were still reeling at the time. And basically,
It was 8 years ago.
It's a blur.
My bottom line, as I recall, was if we can just get through the next 4 years, maybe there won't be big disasters in the Middle East. And the reason from whatever optimism I had was that he had people around him who really were very knowledgeable. He had six generals, people with foreign policy chops, who we thought would keep him in line. And to some extent, they did. Now that's all gone. So we really, I mean, I don't want to dampen the mood of optimism that seems to have overcome all of us, but I think there's real prospects for all kinds of calamities.
That should be the headline if there are any student journalists here.
It could be a photo of him, I'm not in the. So, just to add to that, on the Horn of Africa piece, because that's one of my areas, and I'm from there, we saw the US abdicate leadership from a really strategic part of the world. I think a few years ago, you all probably saw the ship, the Ever Given, that got stuck in the Suez Canal and how that crippled global trade. So the Horn of Africa, the Red Sea region, the Suez Canal, that's a very important, I mean, over 40% of global shipping trade travels through the Suez Canal. And so when stuff happens in that area, whether it's Somali pirates or whether it's, Emirati meddling in the Horn or whatever, that definitely increases tension for everybody. In the last few years, what you've seen is an increase of the Russian footprint in the Horn of Africa, whether it's through the actual government or through private military contractors. Right now, Sudan is basically a non-existent country. They don't really have a government. And a lot of that is being fueled by Iranian and Russian money and arms. And I say all this to say that under the previous Trump term, the United States really did walk back from a lot of leadership in the Horn of Africa. A lot of that was George W. Bush inspired leadership around, the global war on terrorism. I mean, we had a huge footprint in the US or in the Horn of Africa. Trump immediately withdrew American troops from Somalia. You saw sort of a decreased footprint there. Obviously, we still have our military base in Djibouti. That's a very long-standing base. I don't see that going anywhere, but there wasn't real leadership there. The Biden administration appointed a special envoy for the Horn of Africa and, appointed multiple envoys for Sudan. Didn't really do much, but they had people there. And so, there's a question about what does Trump do there? And for me, I don't really see any leadership. So that's a big issue, not just geopolitically, but also to the human rights question earlier. We're not going to see any leadership.
And then I'll get this side next.
Thanks for the panels, professor and panel. Thanks for the panel, professors. This summer I was like such an election year. And pretty much everywhere you could look, there was an election going on. And I was paying a lot of attention to the United Kingdom. I thought that was a really big deal. Where on the surface of this massive labor victory, you have this, I think, pretty frightening outcome or reform waiting for making moves. They only got 4 seats in Parliament, but nonetheless. And so I kind of have a question for pretty much everybody involved here. What's going on with this right-wing move that we're having globally? I feel like I'm hearing about it, and a lot of explanation for the people in my life give is this kind of it's Trump's mind is this right-wing thing. That he in his internal head is making the United States a lot more right. But I'm I think it's one, a global thing, and two, it's just his own personal proclivities that are pushing the world this way. I'm not really convinced. And so I'd love to just have some kind of idea of what I should be looking at for this specific kind of, I think global trend.
So I can speak a little bit about the American case. And so there are a couple things, a lot of things. It's very complex. I mean, none of these questions have very easy or straightforward answers, but there are some things that I've been paying attention to in the American case. And so one of them is that part of it, and those of you who've taken American politics with me have heard the story, one of the themes of the class when I teach it is there's always a gap between who we like to think we are and who we really are as a country. And over time, there are times where that gap gets narrower and there are times when that gap gets bigger. And it's not the case that throughout American history, that gap has gotten uniformly smaller. And so I think a lot of what's been happening in American politics this year, when Trump first came on the scene and when Trump first won, and how can Americans be supporting someone who's criticizing immigrants and, says racist things. But a lot of the data suggests that the movement in public opinion predated Trump. And the argument there is it's more of a backlash to the changing America of the Obama years. And that fits very well within the American story of there being backlash to racial progress, changes in gender norms, changes in sexuality norms. There's always the progress and backlash is our story, and we're in a moment, I think, of backlash that started in becoming very visible and very rapid during the Obama years. So that's one thing. Another thing is throughout the past couple of decades, in the American case, among white voters, there's been what we call partisan sorting, a term you may have heard before, which is basically, we used to have lots of liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, and basically there's an increased match over time. Some of it is Democrats becoming more liberal so that their ideology matches their party. Some of it is people finding the party that matches their ideology, and both are kind of happening. But for non-white voters, that really wasn't happening very much. And the evidence seems to be suggesting that over the past 2 election cycles, it actually is starting to happen now. And so a lot of the movement that you're having towards Republicans, and towards Trump in particular, among Hispanic voters, among Black voters, are ones who already consider themselves to be conservative. And why is that sorting now starting to happen for some non-white voters when it wasn't happening for so long? That's a question I don't think we have good answers to yet. I have a few hypotheses about what it might be. And one of them is thinking about Hispanic voters is that, a lot of people in their mind, when they think of Hispanic voters, they automatically associate them with immigrants and immigration. But a lot of Hispanic people are born here, right? And increasingly so. And we have a very complex set of, legacy of racial classification in this country. And we assume that people who are Hispanic aren't white, and that's the government, treats race and ethnicity separately. But the whole racial dynamics associated with being Hispanic are very complex. And as some of the research shows that the more Hispanic Americans think of themselves as white or prioritize their American identity, they're more likely to be Republican. The more they're English dominant, they're more likely to be Republican. And I just think the Latino population in this country is just becoming more like that, more increasingly born here, increasingly English dominant, increasingly, so that's part of what's going on. Among Black voters, anyway, so that's my hypothesis. One of my hypotheses with Black voters are 2. And I don't have data to support them, but I'm hoping that lots of political scientists will be studying this in the coming years. But one of the hypotheses is, again, thinking about generational change, increasing distance from the civil rights generation, knowing people who are activists in the civil rights movement. It's just that solidarity that formed with the Democratic Party could be fading as a generational issue. And then on top of that, I think there also might be an interesting story with regard to just decreasing in the American population as a whole, religiosity, religious attendance. And we know that Black churches have long been a site of racial solidarity and activism. And if that's happening, of less going to church, less interacting in Black churches, that could also be weakening the tie that may have preserved the ideology party mismatch in previous years. So I know your question was about this global phenomenon, and I gave you very American-centric answers, but I do think that does help explain at least some of what's happening in the US.
Yeah, I do think you're onto something, that something big is happening, and it's not just happening in one country. I don't think it's driven by Donald Trump. I don't think Donald Trump is particularly an ideological character. I don't think he has these strong ideological beliefs that are motivating him. But he is catalyzing and in many ways riding a wave that we're seeing in country after country across the world. And that, I think, I'm venturing out of my area of expertise, so take it for what it's worth. But it does seem to me more and more like there is a crisis of liberalism. Well, the social and economic fruits of liberalism are in the current environment seem to be yielding less and less. There's a lot of anger about it, a lot more injustice, more economic inequality. This is being reflected. The whole immigration issue across the world, the same thing, right? As a result of which, I really do think, let's not sugarcoat it, there is a fascist tendency that you can see across the globe. And the question is going to be, how well will the democracy, the liberal democracy, be able to deal with this fascist resurgence? And I really have my fears about that. Liberal democracies are weak, I think, sometimes in defending themselves against that kind of threat. And it remains to be seen what happens here.
Thank you. Just two things I want to build on. One is the wealth inequality piece. You see that here in the US and globally. That is partly why you're seeing some Black voters and some Hispanic Latino voters go towards Republicans. One actually interesting subset, and this I think requires some more research, but when there's a new class of Black millionaires that are coming up now. And so a lot of them tend to, when it comes to economic wealth issues, tend to vote with the Republican Party. And so, that's an area worth looking into in the long term. And then the other thing just to flag is the immigration piece. And our Europe expert can talk more about this, but like a lot of the rise of the right in Europe is actually due to immigration issues and why you see the European Union so invested in stopping conflicts, particularly in the global south, is because they're inundated with refugees, right? And so, there was a huge spike, obviously, with the Syrian refugees a decade ago, but it's still the case. You're seeing a lot that are coming through, and that has led to right-wing governments that are winning, even in sort of, traditionally liberal areas like the Nordic countries. So that's, I think, migration and wealth, I think, are two big things to look at globally, but also here in the US. But yeah, definitely, Trump is not necessarily the catalyst for any of this. I think he's just sort of the face of what's going on right now. But these issues definitely resonate further. And then on the piece of American issues, the Biden presidency is really, I mean, one of the most liberal, if not the most liberal presidency that we've had ever. In terms of social issues, in terms of where the president has stood, certainly far more left than Obama. And so I think part of what we saw this year was backlash to that in particular.
Any other panelists?
Yeah, I would just expand on that. I think globalization plays a massive role because it includes immigration as well as trade. And I think the issue is, even though globalization has enriched the United States and other liberal democracies in aggregate, it has created stark disparities, especially between more thriving urban centers that have largely reaped the benefits of being hyper connected to other urban centers around the world and have benefited from a big influx of immigrant labor and the whole shift to a knowledge and more service-based set of industries and a highly diversified private sector economy. You compare that to what's gone on in a lot of rural regions where they were highly dependent on, in a lot of rural towns are like dependent on a single factory, and so if that factory goes overseas, the whole town falls into a deep depression, or they're reliant on agriculture or mining or some of these other industries that you just haven't seen the same kind of gains. And when you look at the data, I mean, there's increasing studies coming out from economists now that show things like NAFTA or the so-called China shock really did make a big impact in manufacturing employment in the United States, and that rural towns, because they didn't have more diversified economies, got hit hardest. So that you lose the revenue from the manufacturing plant. Then the local government has to slash local government jobs, which in rural areas employ 20 to 30% of the people in the area, the police force, the teachers, et cetera. Whereas again, I live near New York, you have all kinds of industries that can make up for the shortfall. And I saw some shocking statistics that showed that, after the 2008 financial crisis, more than half of rural regions in the United States still had not recovered to pre-2008 employment levels by 2019. So more than a decade after the financial crisis, you still had a lot of these rural regions that have been completely hollowed out. And then COVID came and just slammed them even more. And the impacts of all this are highly visible. Like you go to some of these towns and the main street is just shuttered. The hospital has is gone. It's moved out. There's like one store. It's a food desert at this point. And so I think there's been a lot of decay in some of these communities, and you've seen that correlate with a big increase in mortality in rural regions, not just in the United States, but in a lot of liberal democracies, where if you live in a rural region now, you're like 50% more likely to die of all causes and several times more likely to die of suicide or alcohol abuse or drug overdoses. And this was not the case 30 years ago. When you compare, you can see the lines, this divergence in economic fortunes take place as hyper-globalization kicks in. And then you also see it, at least in the American case, I know it correlates with a big increase in the partisan gap. I was actually shocked to find that in the 1992 presidential election, rural regions only supported Republicans by a 2% margin over urban regions. So very little gap in this urban-rural thing. But by 2020, that gap had increased tenfold, and it's only increased in the 2022 midterms. And at least as far as I can tell from the exit polls, Trump doubled his margin of victory in rural regions. And so, I don't think it's the only explanation, but I think you can understand how this then overlaps with some of the things the other panelists have talked about, like race, age, education. A lot of these rural regions in the United States are predominantly white and increasingly Latino. A lot of Latinos have actually moved into these areas. They tend to be more Christian, and they're increasingly older because a lot of young people leave. And so you have this depopulation going along with political polarization. So the more of these studies that come out and then I read them, I really see how disruptive, and it just makes sense, something like globalization is. And I think you can compare it to the 1910s, 1920s, which was also coming on the heels of the first wave of globalization in the late 19th century. And this was like the peak of the Ku Klux Klan and like all these xenophobic movements and calls for immigration, severe immigration restrictions. So I think some of these structural trends are once again rearing their head and interacting with a lot of the other variables that some of the other panelists have mentioned.
I'll get back.
I have a question for Professor McLean on general legality of recess appointments, and then more specifically, if you think what's the actual likelihood of it being used, or if it's just more likely a threat to assert power over Senate Republicans?
Yeah, so recess appointments are legal. I mean, it's a constitutional loophole essentially that Trump would be utilizing. So in the Constitution, you say that the president has this power to appoint individuals in the instance of Congress being in recess. This has been used before. So Trump would not be the first person to use this. The means by which he's using it would be unusual. So going back to previous administrations, Clinton uses these, Bush uses these, baby Bush uses these for, a couple hundred appointments each over the course of their term. And Obama tries to use these and uses them a little bit, but actually faces backlash from the Supreme Court. So we get this power clarified in about 2010 or 2012, I can't remember now. But the Supreme Court says that Congress has to be in recess for 10 days before you can start doing recess appointments. So we now have like a more solid groundwork. This is one kind of not unknown. We know that like after 10 days, you can start doing these recess appointments. Trump wants to use these for like cabinet secretaries, which are high level bureaucrats that we've not seen previous administrations use them for. And you're right at the beginning of the term. So the reason you want to do this is because you can have them, you make a recess appointment, and you're getting around the Senate confirmation, and they can be in office essentially unlimited time. So there's something else called acting officials. There's time limits on those types of things. There's not time limits on recess appointments. The place where Trump is going to have difficulty is in getting Senate cooperation. So currently the Senate, even if senators aren't there, they will avoid being in recess by having somebody open the chamber up. Even if senators aren't there, someone's like the designated senator that opens the chamber up. So there's a couple ways that, so you kind of have to have Senate leadership agree to say, we will go on at least a 10-day recess. We won't open the chamber. So you can have that happen. It seems at this point that Senate leadership has said that they are open to looking at this, but this openness seemed quite reluctant. They seem like there's not really a big push towards kind of agreeing with Trump. Where you might have complications is some more right-wing, more Trump-supporting senators who would like to maybe come into the Senate a day that they open and call for a roll call. If you call for a roll call and you don't have a quorum, then that could be a situation where you consider after 10 days the Senate being in recess. So that's one complication you could have. The other is if the House and Senate cannot agree on the length of a recess, then Trump could capitalize on this, that he could get the House on his side. The House could say they're going in recess for a longer period. And in those situations where Congress can't agree on recess, then he can kind of have them stand down. That's another opportunity for him to make a recess appointment. I don't know how serious he is about doing this. I don't think he's going to face a lot of Senate resistance to his picks. And I think that the reason he wants to do it is not even that he thinks he is. It's, a sign of power, and he thinks he shouldn't have to do this and that he should be able to get around Congress. I think Congress is very much going to resist that. And I also think that what we saw today with Matt Gaetz stepping down is a very good sign that it's probably not going to happen. I think that if he thought that it was going to happen, so it is legal, he could technically do this. However, the reason I don't think it's gonna happen is, I think if he thought he could do it, Matt Gaetz wouldn't have stepped down. Because if he thought if it seemed like Senate Republicans were gonna confirm Matt Gaetz, and he'd say, we're gonna do this recess appointment anyway, it doesn't matter what they think. I'm gonna get you through. Maybe he's already soured on Matt Gaetz, and that's why he doesn't want to do this. And he's already kind of annoyed them. I think that he might have some regrets about his Doge appointments at this point. But there's also something to be said for the fact that like, it seems like if Gaetz wouldn't have stepped down, Gaetz does support him, he's loyal. He probably would not have stepped down if he thought that he could have gotten through a recess appointment. So I don't think he's going to do it. However, it is legal to do this. And so this is something that you might look for in lower level bureaucrats. And that's what it's been used for mostly in the past. It's just that often Congress is not willing to go into recess for 10 days at a time. So.
And just to clarify, the reason the House matters is it's only the case when they don't agree that the president can say, I force you to go on recess?
So that's the case, yes, that if the House and Senate disagree, then basically like the president can step in and like adjourn and say like, you're both dismissed. But only when the House and Senate disagree on this case. So that's why that's how the House can play into it.
This is a question for Professor Beckley. We were talking in a Taliaferro class, Professor Taliaferro class about US, South Korea, Japan relations and how the Biden administration, you know, it was a very big step first at a trilateral summit. And part of their success in the administration has been getting South Korea and Japan together. What do you see with the Trump administration in terms of bilateral relations with each of them? And then with the trilateral relation?
Yeah, I think Japan is in a good spot because there's been a clear recognition within the broader national security establishment of just how important Japan is, not just from a base access point, but from broader interoperability militarily as well as economically. I mean, Japan has really taken the lead in trying to get other countries around East Asia to diversify and away from dependence on China's economy. So Japan has actually been paying companies to relocate out of China and either down into Southeast Asia or into Japan. And so Japan has played this important leadership role, and I could easily see a Trump administration basically piggybacking on that. I think basically ever since Shinzo Abe played golf with Trump in the first term, things really turned around and the tariffs on Japan went away. I think South Korea is an interesting case though, because that was the one that really Trump singled out in Asia. You know, why do we have tens of thousands of troops there? Why are we picking a fight with North Korea? Why isn't South Korea paying us more for all of this protection? And because the South Koreans at the time were trying to kind of hedge between the United States and China because they rely so heavily on China's economy, you know, that impulse really came through in the first term. I'm a bit more optimistic about the second term simply because South Korea now is much more staunchly on the American side. I mean, I think after China basically launched a full-blown trade war against South Korea after they imported this missile defense system to defend themselves against North Korea. I was actually just in South Korea in September, and the anti-China sentiment, I was actually shocked that the latest polls show that they hate the Chinese more than they hate the Japanese. And as someone of Japanese ancestry who often has to go and like basically apologize for the biblical brutality that Japan inflicted on South Korea in the 20th century, it was shocking to me that they now really are very wary of China and its role in backing North Korea as well as Russia and these other members of this axis. So simply because South Korea is so much more pro-American now, it makes me more optimistic that Trump will build on the progress both on a bilateral basis as well as trying to build on this trilateral agreement among Japan, South Korea, and the United States.
Thank you.
Professor Beckley, I want to flip your midterm essay prompt back on you. And ask,
I think my kids are calling me. I got to run right now, so.
I just want to ask, what do you think the future of the Russia, China, not aligned, but partnership looks like under Trump 2.0, especially with economic cooperation, China's shipment of dual-use goods to Russia, and then on the flip side for Professor Shovel, do you think
Trump might somehow, drive Russia away from China? And do you think, Trump's willingness to accommodate Putin would affect Putin and Xi's relationship at all?
Yeah, I think in the near term, I expect Russia and China to continue to double down on their bromance and no limits partnership. There, as you expressed and many of your classmates expressed quite eloquently, there are all these chinks in the armor. I mean, they don't share real cultural ties. In fact, Russia, still occupies a lot of formerly Chinese territory. So there's historical bad blood. They share a long border. They've had a falling out in the past. They compete for spheres of influence. Russia obviously doesn't want to become a vassal of China, and China doesn't want Russia torpedoing Xi Jinping's efforts to try to woo back Europe. But at the end of the day, I think, I usually don't use the phrase axis, but I understand why people do, because even though they are very different countries, have different priorities, they share this deep, deep resentment towards the existing international order. I think the more I read, especially the Chinese documents, that there's this view that we are this great civilization, China, and these American upstarts, and first it was the British, and then these American upstarts come in and they think they can start bossing around the international order. And why is it that so much of my technology is made in the West and I have to kowtow to the West in order to maintain access there? And how come every time I go to a conference, everyone is speaking English? And why do the Westerners feel like they can keep wagging their fingers at us? And how come I can't take back territories that I believe belong to me? And you have this chain of American alliances around us. I mean, that roiling resentment fused with just stark geopolitical interests, I think, make for a durable foundation for the near term, for the next decade or so, certainly as long as Putin and Xi are in power. Now, I'm very bearish on both of those countries' futures from an economic and demographic and geopolitical perspective. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that if you can get through sort of the next 10 years or so, and nature takes its course, both from their, the decline in China and Russia's economy, their strategic situation, and then ultimately Xi Jinping and Putin won't be around forever. Maybe at that point, if the line is held, their dreams of reconquering their old empires will start to look sort of fanciful, and maybe their successors will opt for a different course. But for right now, I just see them as saying, look, we hang separately or we stick together. And that seems to be what they're doing. They're sort of fighting back to back, at opposite ends of Eurasia, to push back on what they view as a deeply hostile and threatening West.
Yeah, I'll just very briefly, I agree with everything Professor Beckley said pretty much, just to emphasize that, Russia really depends on China for its war effort, right? But there is a lot of tension and sort of animosity and bad blood and fear of demographics in particular. This whole sort of notion that, Chinese would come and take over land because, there's a lot of land in Russia, but the demographic situation is not great. So this sort of there is this partnership and alliance, but how, and there is this, Professor Beckley said, grievances against the West that both countries share. But at the same time, if you look at the Russian elite since 91, where were they looking for? Like where their mistresses, where their children, where's their money? It's not in China. It has been in the West. So in a way, you can sort of see conflicting sets of interests and pulls and pushes, right? So in a way, although I've been reading lately that some of the Russian elite now are learning Chinese. I don't know, Michael, if you heard that there is, before, like everybody was looking West, kind of, even if they would lambast the West, like this is where they send their children and wives and mistresses and bought houses and so forth. And it seems like it has maybe shifted since 22. Again, for how long, I don't know. I think there is quite a bit of racism in Russia, to be honest. So this sort of, again, yes, China is an important partner. And of course, when the leaders meet, it's all strategic cooperation, what have you. But the way, say, Asian minorities are treated in Russia, it's not great, right? And kind of Chinese, I think, are sort of looked down upon as, kind of in this racial way. So I don't have a good answer to your question. I think it is quite possible that Trump may try to as you put it, sort of to separate, to give Russia something, right, that it would not. But I think given the level of mistrust and, Russia declared itself to be at war with the West, like all of these, Western liberal values and you name it. I mean, they think the West is out to get them, that the West has instigated this regime change in Ukraine. So I think it is possible, but it seems like it would require quite a bit, right? And again, given this, how Russia relies on China economically. So I'm not going to be able to answer the question. I think it's possible, but I wouldn't say that certain. That's problematic.
Professor McLean, you mentioned Doge, and I was just wondering how likely you think it is we'll see some of the massive government cuts that they've been talking about, and what the effects of that might be. Could any of them be positive or negative, or what would they be?
So I think sorry, I'm so used to talking in Cohen, just screaming things. So I think that the first step here is that to actually have Doge, you need Congress's approval in some way. So Congress has to decide to fund this agency, and I don't know if that's going to happen. And so that's kind of the first step there is to this existing. He's also he's appointed these people, he doesn't have the power to appoint anybody yet. I don't know how pleased Trump is with any of his choices at this point. He seems to be quite frustrated with Elon Musk. Lots of public statements about Elon not leaving him alone. He can't get rid of him. He's always around. This doesn't seem to bode super well for keeping this person in your life and your cabinet. And so it's kind of unclear to me whether he will go through with this, actually trying to get this office out here. The second thing here is, so the actual cuts. So Vivek Ramaswamy has been on the podcast circuit, and he's been talking about possible cuts by Social Security number. He seems to be under the impression that Social Security numbers are randomly assigned, which is concerning as they're not randomly assigned. Social Security numbers are assigned based off of where you were born. And also based off of when you were born. And so I think that the Office of Legal Counsel is going to push back heavily on at least this plan for reasons of discrimination. So you do not want a 62-year-old knocking on your door claiming ageism because you nixed the Social Security numbers that happen to be associated with people in certain age ranges. You are also then going to eliminate Social Security numbers the West or the East Coast has a lot of even number Social Security numbers. That's a problem if you choose even or odd, or you're suddenly it's not West Coast, and you eliminated everyone who was born in California from your department. That's concerning. And then I think that there's also the element of there's going to be a point in time when so there's 2.5 million people that work in the civil service. A lot of these people do not have policy responsibilities. You have to have people who do day-to-day work. You have to have people staffing Social Security Administration offices. You have to have people who work in the national parks. And these are things that I don't think, you start cutting these things and you start seeing some real downstream effects. I don't think these cuts are going to be made because I think that there is going to be, there are people in here on the Office of Legal Counsel who are going to say this is a horrible mistake because we have actual checks that need to be distributed that are not going to be distributed, and you're never you're going to be completely just gutted in the public. And I think at the end of the day, Trump cares most about his public opinion and what people think of him. He wants to be well regarded. I don't think he ran for president because he is ideological. I think this was mentioned earlier. I don't think he's an ideologue. I think that he ran because he kind of wants power and he wants people to think highly of him. And if people aren't receiving Social Security checks, no one's gonna be thinking highly of you. So I don't think these things are gonna happen. If they do happen, you're gonna see really strong downstream effects by the fact that people that the federal bureaucracy doesn't have staff in it. And we're all gonna see these things. These are not things that only certain people are seeing, and that they're lofty policy things. If you cut 75% of the federal workforce, I hope no one has a trip plane to Yosemite. These are these things are gonna be affected. Your national parks are gonna be affected. Whether you get checks are gonna be affected. Whether the actual people working in these institutions, your science funding is gonna be affected. All of our lives are gonna be affected, whether we're able to get funding for our projects. And we are probably the least important people that are gonna be affected by this. I hate to say that, but we are not out and triage saving lives, but the federal government funds cancer research. It funds research into debilitating diseases. These are now people who are gonna have their positions taken from them, and that's concerning. I think a third way that it's concerning is that the federal government already relies heavily on contract workers. So we have about 6 to 7 million people who are contract workers for the federal government, and these are individuals who do not work directly for the federal government, but are contracted out. I think that you cut the federal government workforce and you now are relying more on contract workers, which I'm not like here to bash contract workers. If anyone here works as a contractor, this is great. We need these people. However, we don't have, it's much less transparent process and you have much less control over these people. So there could be concerns raised about like outsourcing these jobs to contract workers in terms of like bureaucratic control, transparency, and where your like tax dollars are going type concerns. So I think that there are a number of reasons that this is not going to happen, because I think all of these things are things that would directly affect the public. And as a president, you don't want to necessarily do things that are going to harm, like that are going to be easily traced back to you and harming constituencies. And I think that backlash is likely going to keep a lot of this from happening. And then our first line of defense is Congress. And I don't think Congress is going to be too pleased if someone comes in and says, you know, we're going to cut all these federal jobs and now a bunch of people are unemployed. So the unemployment rate rises. And also now all these unemployed people have nobody to give them their unemployment check and to cut this. So I don't think it's likely it'll happen. But these are just some downstream consequences if it did happen.
Thank you very much for the panel. I just had a question about really focus on the Department of Defense, so maybe open to anybody who would wish to answer. But curious about kind of what you see as the relationship between the executive branch, primarily as Commander-in-Chief, and the Department of Defense. If you have any thoughts on kind of what that relationship looks going forward. Obviously, the military itself is apolitical. But I think we've seen, particularly in the last several years, that there have been moments where it has felt challenging, where you have like Senator Tuberville holding up general officer promotions and movement of general officers into new positions that has affected the military, even if they don't necessarily have a say in that space. So I'm curious what you think that relationship looks like going forward and maybe how that impacts policy for the Department of Defense.
I guess I'll try. That's an excellent question, and I wish I had a more concrete answer. I mean, I think you've seen increasing politicization for, you know, the Tuberville example is a perfect one, basically turning appointments and promotions into a political stunt, and then vice versa. Something I do worry about with the Trump administration is the blurring of the lines between civilian, you know, basically eroding civilian control and promoting and putting generals directly in charge of things and then having them wear their uniforms and really erasing this boundary that has traditionally enforced strict civilian control over the military, and then military competence within, you know, sort of the tactical and logistical challenges that they face. So, you know, this is not an area that I study, but people that I know that do study it are extremely concerned about the future of civil military relations. And the most recent, the one sort of saving grace that they often point out is, like, you know, if Trump thinks he's going to come in and be able to just turn, you know, the Defense Department into his Praetorian Guard or something, or his personal service, that he's going to have a rude awakening, you know, because it's full of a bunch of macho people who don't like to be told what to do. It's the biggest bureaucracy in the world, literally. It's really hard to turn that ship around. And so just through sheer bureaucratic inertia and ego, that might ultimately prevent some kind of radical change that really leads to a full-blown kind of politicization of the military that you would see in, you know, a much more unstable kind of republic or even a dictatorial sort of regime. So you know, I guess that's a note of optimism in the future, but I share your concern about the blurring of these distinctions that I think are so important to manage the military properly.
From a state federal perspective, when we think about immigration and the threat of mass deportation, one thing I would look at is watch if President Trump nationalizes or federalizes the National Guards. You know, he can do that under the Insurrection Act, and so that is completely within the president's authority. So if the president nationalizes the Massachusetts National Guard and says we're going to, march on Cambridge, Massachusetts because they're a sanctuary city, that could open up some real issues. So I don't know what that's gonna look like, but that's an area that I would pay attention to.
So we have time for one more question. It's gonna break my heart that I can't have everyone ask their questions, but it looks like you want to get weigh in on this before we have our last question.
I actually wanted to give one recommendation for a film. So I was on a panel recently over at Newton Cinema for a movie called War Game, which is actually like a simulation put on by veterans about and it talks a lot about basically movements within veteran communities and amongst the US military towards being more right-wing or these incel growth, and how this could help President Trump and what the guard places or the guardrails in place. And a lot of defense individuals high up in the Defense Department are participating in this and thinking about these things. It's not directly related to your question, but I thought it was a really interesting perspective and something that I really hadn't thought a whole lot about until I watched. So.
Right, close out.
Great. It was funny because you were kind of alluding to the question I was gonna ask, with regards to you talked about earlier, these coalitions of governors coming together, and starting to see the ways in which they could push back against some of this federal, and we're gonna start to see Democrats advocating for states' rights, because I think it's also really interesting, but how do you see that within the context of we're already starting to see and this was with regards to your recent paper too, on state identities and stuff, on how people view their state identities. Are we going to start to see more polarization where that's concerned across red state, blue state lines?
Oh yeah, that's already happening. So, I don't know if you know, but the Commonwealth of Massachusetts spends tax dollars putting up advertisements, billboards and digital ads in Florida and Texas saying, hey, women, come here, we give abortions. I mean, it's in better language, but that's literally what they're saying. So you're gonna see a lot more of that. I think, there's going to be increased polarization. You see this on the migration issue, right? I mean, the border state governors are dropping off, migrants in the sanctuary states, right? And so you're gonna see a lot more of that. So the divide between red states and blue states, I think, only gets worse, at least in the near future, particularly along these so-called culture war issues. I think that's gonna be more of an issue. And you're already seeing this again, with the governors of Colorado and Illinois, and someone help me, I forgot the name of the group that they just started, but the Democrats, governors defending democracy or something. So yeah, they established the group. They don't really have a mission yet, but they exist. So you're seeing this sort of blue wall that's being created, I think that's also going to create sort of a tense standoff with the federal government. Also worth noting, the governors that are part of this effort mostly have presidential ambitions of their own. So, something to pay attention to.
Yeah, and I would also add, going back to my comment earlier about we have this vision of who we are as a country, and then there's who we really are. And just 2 days ago, there was a columnist who wrote in the Washington Post, the headline of the article was, "New York is my country now." And it was basically saying all these visions and aspirations I have for the country. For the next 4 years, I'm focusing on preserving them and protecting them and shoring them up in New York and doing what I can to help people in other states do the same, but seeing the state as the site for fighting for your values and your priorities and working with state governments to do that. And that was the essence of what, and so, this was a columnist writing this kind of grand theory that I'm researching right now, but I think that a lot of people are going to feel that even if they don't know the words yet to articulate that that's what they're feeling of how can I, look to the things that make me feel good about politics, and if they're happening at my state, I'm directing your attention there and your loyalties and political activism there. But even from the first Trump administration, I mean, we talked about checks through Congress, but the states were sites of a lot of checks on Trump through their court systems and through their election officials, and plenty of Republican officials in states who didn't do what Trump wanted them to do. So I definitely think watching state identities, states as sites of resistance to Trump is going to get a lot of attention. But I also think it's important to also not overly caricature the red and the blue and what's happening among elites and activists versus kind of ordinary people. And you certainly have, I think I forget the statistic I see, but like there are more Trump voters in California than there are in most other states, like there's a lot of voters who voted for Harris in these red states. And so like, we're all everywhere, but policy happens somewhere. And so the states are going to be where there's definitely a lot of action to pay attention to. So with that, I will thank all of you for your attention and attending, and all of our panelists today. And I'm sorry for everyone's question. I'm truly excited.